Please be seated. Members of the Corps of Cadets, Mr. Ramsey, President of the Board of Visitors, and members of the board, members of the academic board, faculty and staff, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this morning's convocation marking the opening of the 2015-2016 academic year. We're honored to have with us national political analyst and columnist, Ms. Kirsten Powers, today's convocation speaker, whom I have the pleasure to introduce to you in a few moments. First, it gives me great pleasure to recognize the cadets who are seated to your front. They are cadets distinguished in academic merit, and I ask that you join me in expressing our congratulations to them on their accomplishments. Each year at this time, we gather to acknowledge and to celebrate the central mission of the Institute, which is to produce educated, informed young men and women who have the knowledge, the skills, fitness, and character to be useful citizens for all professions, and ready, if qualified, to serve as citizen soldiers. The means by which we seek to accomplish this mission have changed over the course of the Institute's nearly 176 years, but the mission remains the same. On the surface of things, VMI always strikes people as a place that is traditional and unchanging. Gothic buildings, cadets in uniform, parades, and a daily routine that appears, well, routine. But below the surface, as we all know, that image of the Institute is misleading. Large and small alterations take place every year at VMI as the Institute strives to meet the changing educational needs of cadets and the varied needs of an evolving society. Today's popular culture has a word to describe this phenomena, and the word is trending. As most of you know, the word is applied to what is new, what is catching attention, and where things appear to be going. And over the years, the VMI faculty and staff have done an excellent job of paying close attention not only to the basics of their various disciplines, but they have also attempted to keep abreast of changes and signs of future developments. Today, we can use the word trending to describe the attention to what is new and where things are going at VMI. And we can ask, what is trending in the academic program at the Institute? One area that is trending is academics at VMI and holds the interest of faculty and cadets is the Institute's commitment to international and global education, opportunities, challenges, and concerns. And I'm not speaking narrowly of our highly successful major in international studies or the excellent offerings of our international programs. Instead, I'm speaking of the international context in which many disciplines are now viewed. We live in an increasingly interrelated world, and almost any profession that graduates will enter will have some global component to it. A few years ago, a well-known alumnus once said of VMI, "We are small, but we are everywhere." And that now applies to the world, where VMI graduates are engaged in multinational corporations, in the military, in government service, and a myriad of other endeavors. One obvious area of this global trending is the Department of Modern Languages, where we now offer the strategic languages of Arabic, Mandarin Chinese, Spanish, and French. The opportunities for international travel and work are found everywhere, and knowledge of languages is key to success on that stage, despite the myth that everyone in the world speaks English. Limited only by the number of faculty, the Institute can support the number of majors and minors appropriate to a college of our size. Emphasis has been placed on a balance between traditional and strategic foreign languages. Another trending area at VMI and across the academic landscape is a renewed emphasis on the ability to communicate clearly, effectively, persuasively. Teaching and learning communication skills in college are receiving increased emphasis across our country, and the target is no longer primarily English majors, but for those entering medicine and engineering, business, the military, and other key professions. VMI has responded by strengthening the Writing and Fine Arts program in the Department of English, Rhetoric, and humanistic studies. Skill in oral presentations, written reports, and the methods of communicating electronically have taken a prominent place in the education of all cadets, and I think it will continue to grow. And as an institute, VMI, from its beginning, stressed science, mathematics, and engineering, in addition to the liberal arts. Of all the important trending areas in our society, somewhat now driven by national security means, the ever-growing importance of math and science, technology is perhaps the most visible. In recent years, emphasis in the nation has been placed on the development of what is called STEM programs, science, technology, engineering, and math. VMI faculty members have been active players in this effort and have received highly competitive grants from a variety of funding agencies. And cadets as well have received grants in support of their research at VMI, often in conjunction with our faculty members. Furthering VMI's commitment to STEM, the Mathematics and Computer Science Department was restructured as applied mathematics as opposed to a theoretical curriculum. A new Mathematics Education Resource Center now helps cadets excel in mathematics coursework. We have also seen the creation of a new Department of Computer and Information Sciences. In biology, a new class in conservation biology has been added, featuring field excursions and classwork with the aim of offering opportunities for considering the effect of human conservation efforts through understanding how to apply the principles of ecology, wildlife management, and sustainability, the goal of global conservation. And in economics, a Web 2.0 for business has been added that teaches how social media sites are used in the business world today. Across the nation, undergraduate research has been trending for some years now, and VMI has been at the forefront of this movement. The Institute's undergraduate research program has played an increasingly important role in the education of our cadets and has brought attention and a number of prestigious state and national awards to individual cadets, our faculty, and to VMI. In 2005, VMI and Washington Lee University co-hosted the 19th National Conference on Undergraduate Research. It was the first time for the event in Virginia and about the third in the entire South. The lesson is clear. Experience with serious and sustained research on the undergraduate level greatly enhances a cadet's education and prepares him or her for the future, whether it be in graduate school, professional school, industry, business, or the military. Every degree program now has a capstone or signature project to culminate its academic experience. One needs only to look at traditional print or the electronic media or the many new social media sites to see what is trending. And VMI, for example, is mentioned now favorably in Princeton Review, Forbes, U.S. News & World Report, Atlantic Monthly, and Money Magazine, which have ranked VMI easily in the top quartile of all public and private schools. The idea of leadership education is one of the trending ideas in American higher education today. And one need only read the mission statements of many colleges and universities to see that they are committed to educating leaders for a society. Leadership education and training have always been a major part of the mission of VMI. That historic emphasis has been formally expanded to include an ethical component thanks to the recent development of the VMI Center for Leadership and Ethics. Conferences, lectures, seminars, and discussion sessions at the center have provided cadets and faculty members with valuable experiences that have supplemented and enhanced what goes on in the classroom and have brought well-deserved attention to the Institute. Among the several goals of the leadership program are civility, mutual respect, and encouraging cadets to be open-minded to different viewpoints and to develop informed opinions of their own, which brings us really to today's program. The Institute and the Center for Leadership and Ethics have as one part of its mission statement the ethical consideration of leadership. And the focus this year will be on ethical considerations in the age of technology and ethical dilemmas in the digital age. And ironically, the new social media and the digital communication, by opening the lines of communication, have also made possible a narrowing of opinions and intolerance for competing or controversial ideas. The conflict in part of what is being called the current free speech debate. The censoring of ideas found in the social media and also can be found throughout society and even on college campuses. Hostility to diverse viewpoints and free speech has grown, and debate is often shut down. Our speaker this morning, Ms. Kirsten Powers, has written an influential book on the subject that has drawn much attention, including prominent mention in a recent article in New York Magazine. And to judge the attention she and her book are receiving, one could rightly say that she is trending. As you can read in the detailed biographical note contained in the program for today's convocation, Mrs. Powers is a columnist for the Daily Beast, the New York Post, and a Fox News political analyst. In her new book, The Silencing How the Left is Killing Free Speech, is a New York Times bestseller. What makes Mrs. Powers of special interest to her viewers and readers and to us here today is that although she is an analyst for Fox News, she does occasionally identify herself as a proud liberal. And yet, her book chronicles a growing threat to free speech in America coming from the far left side of the political spectrum. As the writer in the New Yorker put it, Powers, a liberal and Fox News pundit, delivers a stark verdict in The Silencing. She detects, among those she might once have considered ideological allies, an aggressive, illiberal impulse to silence people, which often takes the form of intolerance of any view that is judged to be intolerant. She is disturbed by the gradual swing to intolerance, especially on college campuses. Liberals are supposed to believe in diversity, she writes, which should include diversity of thought and belief. This, she finds, is fading fast. Moreover, she laments the byproduct of such intolerance, which is an insidious strain of self-censorship. Here then, at VMI Convocation 2015, to speak on what has been called the new censorship is Ms. Powers. Welcome to the Institute.
Thank you so much. Thank you, General, for that nice introduction, and it's such an honor to be here. I really am in awe of your dedication and your commitment to your country, and it's very humbling as well to be invited to come and speak to you. Of course, I'm also always happy to be anywhere where Bill O'Reilly can't interrupt me. I like to finish my sentences, and I like free speech, and unfortunately, free speech is under attack on our nation's campuses, but also in our society at large, but particularly on our campuses. Debate and dissent are dying, and they're being replaced by an authoritarian groupthink that really flies in the face of honest inquiry and pursuit of knowledge, which, after all, is the whole point of going to college, I think. Campus speakers who question liberal orthodoxy have been protested and disinvited. When they do manage to make it onto a lot of our campuses today, they are treated to smear campaigns, speech disruptions that make it impossible for people even to listen to their speeches. Pro-life students have been compared to terrorists and white supremacists in an effort to not deny them their right to express their views on their campuses. Trying to determine what is going to cause somebody's offense is a fool's errand. Some are too silly to believe, such as sorority sisters who are forced to publicly repent for a Taco Tuesday event, or a New Hampshire college canceling an Afrobeat band because there were too many white people. And Yale students were banned from putting the word sissies on a t-shirt, calling Harvard students sissies, even though it was a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald. But others are less silly. At the Vanderbilt University, the InterVarsity Campus Fellowship was derecognized by the university because leaders refused to have leaders who didn't believe in the Christian faith. When the leader of the group asked the administrators, "Are you seriously telling me that I can't require my Bible study teachers to believe in the Trinity?" the teacher said, "Yes, that's exactly what we're telling you, because this would be offensive to some people." Or what if you believe the most qualified person should get the job? Then you, according to a University of California faculty leading training handout, are a racist. This phrase, along with America is a melting pot or America is the land of opportunity, were deemed racial microaggressions at this taxpayer-funded institution. What are racial microaggressions, you may be wondering? These are intentional or unintentional slights that are made against people of color. The fact that well, first of all, let me just say, obviously making any racially offensive statements is wrong, but that's not what this is about. In this context, anything unintentional, even polite small talk, for example, can be deemed as an act of aggression. So a person asking somebody, a person of color, where they are originally from is actually considered a racial microaggression because this person was obviously suggesting that the student was not born in the United States, even though that probably wasn't what they were saying. But that is still treated as an act of aggression, even though they're just trying to be nice. And so, as you can imagine, anything can be a microaggression. According to the Facebook page of a Princeton group that tracks them, they explain what counts as harmless banter to some may be emotionally triggering to other people. The fact that you don't intend it to be harmful doesn't make you any less of an aggressor. The students claimed, I'm so sorry, and in November 2013, more than 24 graduate students at UCLA entered a classroom of their professor, surrounded the professor, and accused him of, quote, engaging in hostile and unsafe climate for scholars of color. The students claimed that they had been victims of racial microaggressions, including when this professor changed the capitalized word of indigenous to a lowercase, and the students said that this was allegedly disrespecting this student's ideological view. So now what we have is teaching is treated as an act of aggression and a racial act of aggression. And naturally, there are sexist microaggressions. An example from the University of California is somebody asks a woman how old she is. She says she's 31. The person glances at her ring, and they have actually engaged in an act of sexist microaggression because they're suggesting that she should be married because she's 31. So be careful. Other sexist microaggressions, men and women have equal opportunities, and gender plays no part in who we hire. It's tempting to laugh all of this off because it seems silly, frankly, but it stops being funny if you're the person who has been tarred as a racist or a misogynist for an offhanded comment or for perhaps believing the wrong thing, because as we'll see, often many things are racist and misogynist merely for not being liberal. For professors, it could be a career ender, and for students, such missteps have the potential to do serious harm to their academic standing. At Washington State University, an instructor informed students that they were banned from using various words, including referring to women as females and men as males. The professor warned on the class syllabus, oppressive and hateful language will be handled accordingly, including but not limited to removal of the class without attendance or participation points, failure of the assignment, and in extreme cases, failure for the semester. Or what if you consider yourself a proud American, something that I assume many people here believe? Well, that would be considered problematic at the University of New Hampshire, according to a bias-free language guide that the university posted on their website. Students and faculty were advised instead to use the phrase resident of the United States or U.S. citizen so as not to offend people from South America. They also found offensive the words mothering and fathering. They said they should be replaced with parenting in order to, quote, avoid gendering a non-gendered activity. This is straight out of a George Orwell novel. It's more than just a language preference or an attempt to avoid hurt feelings. It's thought control and it's forced conformity to an ideological agenda. In this case, it would be to try to ban speech that people deem as patriotic or to ban speech of people who believe in the traditional family. If people believe the United States is a problem, they can say that, and they're free to say that. If people believe that a child doesn't need a mother or a father, they're also free to say that and make their case. But what they should not be free to do is to treat anybody who holds those views and expresses those views as some sort of biased speech criminal. The University of New Hampshire guide explained that this speech policing was not a means to censor, but rather to create dialogues of inclusion where all of us feel comfortable and welcomed. In Orwell's 1984, the ruling party used contradictory slogans such as ignorance is strength, slavery is freedom, to keep citizens in a constant state of confusion and fear, frankly. At the University of New Hampshire, likewise, they are banning speech to create dialogues, which makes absolutely no sense. And then they say we're doing it for all of us. But by all of us, they mean everybody who thinks like us, because of course, there's no proliferation of speech codes on campuses across the country that ban speech that offends Christians or conservatives, and nor should there be. But it's uniformly coming from one direction. According to the 2015 report by the Foundation for Individual Rights and Freedom, it's called FIRE, of the 437 schools that they surveyed, more than 55% maintain severely restrictive red light speech codes. These are policies that clearly and substantially prohibit protected free speech. These are particularly dangerous because they're so subjective. So what is offensive is defined by the mostly liberal professors and administrators at universities. Which is why FIRE found, out of the hundreds of complaints that they receive every year from students and faculty who have been silenced on campaigns, who've been on campuses, and who've been censored on campuses, that the complaints were from people who were overwhelmingly censored from the left. Let's be clear, there is no equal opportunity attack on free speech on college campuses. It's coming from one direction, and it's coming from the left. And it pains me to say that because I am somebody who has grew up in a Democratic family, and I consider myself liberal, and I think many liberals find this offensive, but there's no question that it's coming from the left. In my book, I refer to these people as the illiberal left because their behavior is so illiberal. It flies in the face of the liberal values of tolerance and dissent and debate and free speech. And you know, they've turned colleges into these sort of incubators of intolerance and then unleashed their little roving Robespierres onto our society, and we're starting to see the impact that they are having on our society as well. Of course, I want to be clear, all liberals do not do this. In fact, I would even argue probably most of the liberals I know do not do this. And precisely because they find this to be so illiberal. And at the same time, I'm not saying no conservatives ever do it, though as you'll see in a minute, when they do, they don't find as receptive of an audience usually with the administrators to their complaints. In June of this year, a liberal professor, wrote on the liberal website Vox a piece that was titled, "I'm a liberal professor, and my liberal students terrify me." And so afraid was he of his students that he wrote it under a pseudonym. And he explained that for the past decade, he's been teaching at a unnamed mid-sized public university, and he has started to notice that there's this trend towards students being able to derail an academic career of a professor merely by claiming offense. And he gave an example of one adjunct professor who didn't have their contract renewed because a student had been upset about the fact that a Mark Twain book had been assigned, and this student found it offensive. On his anonymous blog, this professor wrote, saying anything that goes against liberal orthodoxy is now grounds for a firing. Even if you make a reasonable and respectful case, if you so much as cause a liberal student a second of complication or doubt, you face the risk of demonstrations, public call-outs, and severe professional consequences. He noted that this speech policing has created an academic climate where teachers are afraid to make students think. What if a conservative student complains? This professor wasn't concerned about this because he said, I would not get fired for angering a Republican, so long as I did it respectfully and so long as it happened in the course of legitimate classroom instruction. Case in point, last year at Marquette University in Milwaukee, a philosophy instructor told a student who had raised gay marriage in a class that this was homophobic and not appropriate to bring up in class. The student complained to the administration. The administration didn't do anything about it, so the student told another professor about it. The professor blogged about it on his blog, blasting the university for its lack of tolerance for free speech. And this professor was immediately suspended, told he had to leave the campus, was not allowed to have any contact with the students, and then they are now in the process of trying to revoke his tenure. And Marquette's hostility to free speech goes beyond this incident. In another incident, they had a teacher training slide that portrayed two students talking to each other about how they opposed same-sex marriage, not in any kind of bigoted way, they were just actually talking about it on campus, which I think people are supposed to do. And a third student overhears them and is offended. And the student reports them to the administration, and the slide says this was the correct way to handle this situation. It's hard to imagine something more intellectually chilling than a policy that turns students into informants on each other, merely for having a conversation, in discussing them in a way that had not been sanctioned by their university administrators. And it's not just same-sex marriage that's toxic on campuses. At UCLA, a student group faced ferocious protests and fines when they simply attempted to invite a group to protest against their pro-immigration stance. On abortion, an issue the country is evenly divided on, Greg Lukianoff, who is the head of that organization I mentioned earlier, of FIRE, he himself is a liberal atheist, and he's noticed, and a pro-choice, and he's noticed that while his lawyers proudly defend pro-choice students, free speech rights, that they are overwhelmingly more likely to be defending a pro-life student. At Northern Kentucky University, a professor told her students that they should exercise their free speech rights and destroy a pro-life display that had been approved by the university. The professor was captured on video, helping her students crush and rip up little crosses that had been set up in order to protest Roe v. Wade. And at Dartmouth College, a student plowed over a similar pro-life display, this time using little American flags, and ran over it with his car, which ironically had a coexist bumper sticker. Can't make this stuff up. And at Johns Hopkins, a pro-life group was denied university status because when the student government administration compared them to white supremacists. An SGA member told a reporter that anti-abortion rights demonstrations made her feel personally violated, targeted, and attacked at a place where I previously felt safe. An SGA leader told a reporter, "We have the right to protect our students from anything that makes them uncomfortable." But students are supposed to feel uncomfortable on campuses about ideas. They should feel safe physically, but they should feel challenged intellectually. The kind of discomfort that they should be experiencing is the kind that makes you seriously contemplate your ideas and to figure out whether or not they hold merit. And also, I don't think it's hard to imagine what this student government association leader would have said if a pro-life student had said, "I'm uncomfortable with the pro-choice demonstration." That really wouldn't garner a lot of sympathy. And again, nor should it. I think that this is what should be happening on campuses. Perhaps the most extreme case was a case at University of California, Santa Barbara, where a feminist studies professor physically attacked a 16-year-old pro-life demonstrator who was handing out pro-life literature and then stole her sign and destroyed it. She claimed that she had been triggered by the poster, and she called the peaceful demonstrators terrorists. She told police she had a moral right to her behavior, and she was just setting a good example for her students when she, again, physically attacked a 16-year-old. Miller Young told the officer that her rights had been violated by the presence of a pro-life demonstration on campus. This is also a public university, and they had had approval from the university. When the officer asked her what right exactly has been violated, she says, "My personal right to go to work and not be in harm." So the existence of a peaceful demonstration is harmful. The police report reported her as saying that her actions were in defense of her students and her safety. Though Miller Young was found guilty of grand theft, vandalism, and battery, she was never publicly censured, and she continues to teach at the University of California, Santa Barbara, which is a taxpayer-funded institution. Perhaps most telling about this story is that faculty and students from across the country came to her defense and blamed the demonstrators for provoking her violent response. USSB's chancellor, alluding to the outsiders and provocateurs who held the demonstration, he said they peddled hate and intolerance and seemed to sympathize with the professor rather than the people who had had actual crimes committed against them. Even satire is under attack on many college campuses. In 2013, at the University of Alaska, the student newspaper ran an April Fool's Day issue in which they gently mocked the women's studies department at the university in a clearly satirical piece. For this, a gender studies professor who was offended, again, it's always the problem, launched a sexual harassment claim against the student newspaper and accused them of creating a hostile environment. And actually ended up filing 2 complaints. One of the complaints actually resulted in a Title IX investigation into the campus newspaper for constitutionally protected free speech. Ironically, the editor-in-chief who wrote the article that was so offensive was herself a pro-choice feminist. She just thought it was funny. And yet her life was turned upside down. She was under investigation for 9 months, and the university only desisted when they were threatened with a lawsuit for violating the First Amendment. A similar incident happened at the University of Michigan with a student named Omar Mahmoud. He wrote a satirical column for one of the independent campus newspapers there in which he was mocking political correctness. He was a Muslim who considered himself conservative and libertarian, and in it he was mocking the idea of white privilege, and he wrote of his struggles as a man of color, having to face white privilege everywhere, including, quote, white snowflakes falling thick upon the autumn leaves, burying their colors. He wrote sarcastically of the indignities he faced for being left-handed and how his humanity was reduced to his left-handedness. Mimicking the language of the overwrought victimhood so prevalent of the illiberal left, he complained that, quote, the University of Michigan does literally nothing to combat the countless instances of violence we encounter every day. Whenever I walk into a classroom, I can hardly find a left-handed desk to sit in. In big lecture halls, I'm met with countless stares. As I walk up the aisle along the left-handed column, the university cannot claim to be my school while it continues to oppress me. For this, he was even warned by the editor of another student newspaper that he wrote that his article created a hostile environment, and that someone on the editorial staff felt threatened by what he had wrote. He was given the opportunity to make a public apology for what I just read to you, or he was going to lose his column on the student newspaper. He decided he wasn't going to do a public apology. He lost his column, and as he's being treated as the aggressor, his home was attacked. It was vandalized with obscene attacks and language, a picture of the devil, and eggs and hot dogs were thrown at his door. But he's the aggressor. Because in this new paradigm, disagreement with a liberal idea is never sincere, and it's never worthy of debate. It's clearly misogyny or racism or homophobia or bigotry, so what is there to debate? But most important of all is that, and you may have noticed this, is that disagreement is actually in itself violent. It is an act of an aggression, even if it's not expressed aggressively, even if it's unintentional. Look at all the different ways that people that I've already talked about have described free speech. At Johns Hopkins, the pro-choice student felt personally violated, targeted, and attacked by the mere idea of a pro-life demonstration. Dr. Miller-Young said that the pro-life demonstration it threatened her safety. The satirical piece was threatening. The professor who made a grammar correction, had committed an act of aggression, a microaggression. The casting of disagreements of non-sanctioned views as violence and aggression is a means to justify an authoritarian crackdown on certain words and ideas. After all, if something is violent, how can you not do something about it? How can you not act in the face of violence? It's also an effective tactic to delegitimize people who the liberal left would like to see silenced. In 2012, Wendy Kaminer, who is she's a feminist free speech activist, she's liberal, she joined Smith College's alumni event on a discussion about free speech. In it, somebody brought up the fact that some people found Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn offensive because of the use of the N-word. So Wendy Kaminer said to the audience, "What do you hear when I say the N-word?" And the audience said back the full word. And then she said it herself, and then she said, "See, nothing bad happened." Now, is it something I would have necessarily said? I don't think so. But it's also pretty obvious to me that it was a provocative attempt to make a point, which is that in some cases, such as with classic literature, perhaps we can tolerate things that would in another context be intolerable. At a minimum, I can see that she was not actually harming anybody with this word, and yet she was told, after she said it, students from Smith College accused her of engaging in making racist comments, which she clearly wasn't doing, and she was accused of committing an explicit act of racial violence by the editor of the Smith student newspaper. When Northwestern feminist film scholar Laura Kipnis wrote an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education called "Sexual Paranoia Strikes Academe," students protesting her article demanded that the university do something about the violence expressed in Kipnis's article. Except there was nothing violent in the article, there was no violent language, there was no call for violence, it was just the mere expression of an opinion that the students disagreed with, that they viewed as an act of violence that needed to be remedied. And the university complied with the Title IX investigation into this very popular professor who was ultimately cleared. But what's important to note here is that whether you agree or disagree with what these two women said, we should be able to recognize that they don't constitute an act of violence, and that they are clearly trying to make a point. And if you find the point they're making abhorrent, then disagree with them, argue with them, use persuasion and debate. But trying to delegitimize them or silence them through intimidation tactics is not the answer. American enterprise scholar Christina Hoff Sommers is another person who has experienced this a lot. She had spoken a few months ago to Georgetown University and Oberlin College on what's called equity feminism. It's her criticism of liberal feminism. And before she even set foot on campus in Oberlin, the student newspaper ran an open letter from campus feminists saying that having her on campus was harmful, so let's pull together in the face of this violence. The alleged violence was that Christina Hoff Sommers has been critical of how rape statistics are calculated, and for this they called her a rape apologist. Ironically, it was Oberlin's administration was so alarmed by how the students were reacting to her and the things that they were posting online that they gave her a police escort to the speech. Meanwhile, the students who had inspired security for somebody who they felt was under threat organized a safe space for students as Hoff Sommers spoke on the speech. According to the Oberlin View, approximately 35 students and one dog huddled together in this safe space as Sommers spoke. Events unfolded in a similar fashion at Georgetown University, where in advance of her talk, the student postings were so frantic that the university sent security into the audience of her speech. Again, a sign outside her speech directed students to a safe space, and campus feminists marched into her talk on feminism, holding signs such as trigger warning, anti-feminism, putting feminism on the same level as a post-traumatic, disagreements over feminism on the same level as a post-traumatic stress disorder. So what is a trigger warning, you may be wondering? Oberlin College administrators explained to professors that anything can be a trigger: a smell, a song, a scene, a phrase, a place, a person, and so on. Some triggers can't be anticipated, but some can. Books that have been deemed in need of a trigger warning are The Great Gatsby and Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Colonialism as a subject can require a trigger warning. It should be obvious that the students who are demanding these trigger warnings in safe spaces are, in fact, not passive victims, but are actually the victimizing aggressors. By attaching toxic names to people like they did with Christina Hoff Sommers, they're seeking to delegitimize her in this case, and really anybody else who even expresses ideas that are like hers or that differ from liberal dogma. The goal really isn't to keep anybody safe. The goal is to silence people who are expressing the wrong views. Because the liberal left doesn't argue ideas. They just call people racist and misogynist and homophobes, and then they call that a dialogue. And in fact, safe spaces, if you think about it, are in themselves an intimidation tactic. If Christina Hoff Sommers or any other speaker comes to campus and requires a safe space, then what does that say about them? They're dangerous, right? If they're so dangerous that they require a safe space, then they probably shouldn't be on campus. This is a way to keep people who are expressing the wrong ideological views from coming to campus. And of course, there are people who are legitimately suffering from PTSD, and that's a serious issue, and they should be given support, and there should be intervention. They shouldn't be used as props and ideological stunts. And if anything needs a safe space on campus, let's face it, it's free speech. Hoff Sommers has been lecturing on campuses for 2 decades, and she told me that this is the first time she's ever needed security, that she has in the past been greeted with disagreement. People come ready to debate her, but they were interested in talking to her. And she says now people don't even want her to be on the campus. And many commentators have explained this as they've basically said this is a result of helicopter parenting. These are people who are emotionally fragile because they were overly coddled by their parents. But the problem isn't just that these students are precious and privileged, though that is obviously a problem. The problem is that they're authoritarians. They just cannot tolerate hearing what people think if it doesn't comport to their worldview. If they were just worried about hurt feelings, then there would be a simple way to avoid that. They just could not go to the speech. The fact that they don't want the college Republicans to hear from somebody has nothing to do with their feelings, because it's not just that they don't want to hear certain views, it's that they don't want anybody to hear certain views. And you have to remember also that this speech policing is not limited just to students. The professors and the administrators are often willing participants in this. They're enablers, and sometimes they're the aggressors themselves. And so I think that the best way to understand this, and as I was writing my book, it really struck me of how much these people are they're secular religious zealots. They behave like a fundamentalist religious person who just cannot handle hearing anything that goes against what they believe, because they have found the truth, right? The capital T truth, and there's just nothing to talk about. And their bullying is really sort of a self-sanctifying crusade. It's like what makes them holy is just lording over other people their self-righteous rightness on the issues. And unfortunately, it's proving to be very effective. When Bill Maher, who many of you may know from HBO, and he holds Christians and conservatives in absolute contempt, he was invited to give the commencement speech at Berkeley, and did the college Republicans complain? No. The protest came from campus leftists who said that Maher had engaged in hate speech when he criticized Islam. But again here, the goal was not to soothe hurt feelings, because Maher wasn't even coming to talk about religion. He was coming to do a commencement address, but had nothing to do with Islam. The goal was to criticize people to delegitimize people who criticize Islam, so that others will think twice before they do the same. Which leads us to the topic of commencement shaming, which is the phrase I use to refer to this trend on campuses of turning what is meant to be an honor, inviting someone to come and give a commencement address, into a high-profile public humiliation. And for many years, we're having increasing headlines in the news about conservatives who had been invited to give commencement addresses being protested by liberal students and faculty and then having to withdraw. And in 2014, 2 of the most accomplished women in the world, Condoleezza Rice and IMF head Christine Lagarde, were both forced to withdraw after there were complaints from the left. According to the free speech group FIRE, this trend of speech cancellations has been accelerating at an astounding pace. In the 6 years through 2009, there was many speech cancellations on campus than in the preceding 22 years. And conservative speakers were targeted with nearly twice the frequency. And FIRE found that if you're going to face a disinvitation push, you are 3 times more likely to have it come from your left. And just to show you how effective this has been, last year's commencement season, we actually didn't have a lot of these headlines about this, because it turns out that after 25 Democratic political figures spoke at the commencements of the 60 of America's top universities, that actually no conservatives had been invited. So what seemed like progress, the fact that people weren't being disinvited, actually showed a lack of progress, because none were invited, so none had to be disinvited. And so either universities have just decided that it's not worth the trouble to offend their liberal students, or maybe it could be both. The conservatives have decided that they don't want to risk the chance of accepting an invitation and then being humiliated on a national stage. But either way, the speech police are winning. Meanwhile, next week, roughly 8,000 evangelical students at a Liberty University will gather to hear the Jewish, non-religious, pro-choice, pro-gay marriage, socialist Democrat Bernie Sanders deliver the convocation speech. There will be no trigger warning. The silencing campaign is not just a problem for the individuals who get caught in the crosshairs of the liberal left, it's a problem for everybody. If you don't have the clash of ideas on a college campus, and again, in society at large, but particularly on a college campus, there is no way to attain knowledge. You have to have this, the bruising of ideas coming and the clashing of ideas coming against each other to test out what you believe and to figure out what you believe. And if you're in an environment where you're afraid to say something because you don't know, like maybe it's going to be offensive, because again, this is so undefinable, right? It's not, it could be anything. It could be intentional, it could be unintentional. And so you start to think, well, I don't want to say that because what if everybody thinks I'm X, Y, or Z, one of these horrible labels? And so people stop saying what they think, unless it's the pre-approved script. And also you have a generation of students at many campuses who are learning that it's actually a righteous act to silence people, that you don't need to debate, that you can just dismiss people with name calling. We have to, libertarian professor Steven Pinker, he's at Harvard, talks about, he's a major critic of the lack of free speech on campuses, and he talks about how, the philosopher Karl Popper talks about that you need to have conjecture and refutation, basically, to attain knowledge. But in order to have the conjecture part, you have to have an assurance of free speech. And what the liberal left is doing on campuses is they're just short-circuiting this process. It's at exactly the place where it's supposed to be happening the most, which is on college campuses. And students are instead sort of learning groupthink. They're learning how to think like everybody else and not be original and not say things that might offend somebody. I've shared to you a lot of stories today that have been made public, but I think what's important to remember is how many stories exist that we don't know about, because the effect of all of this is to chill free speech. If people see other people losing their jobs or being punished academically, they are going to choose to stay silent. That's just a simple fact. I don't think, it's quite clear that most people are not looking to get into the middle of some ideological battle merely by having an opinion that's unpopular, and so they're more likely to keep it to themselves. How many students at the University of Alaska or the University of Michigan are going to think twice before they write satire that challenges the status quo, which is really what satire is supposed to do. Do they want to lose their column? Do they want to be shunned and accused of being threatening and quasi-violent for writing something that they thought was funny and challenging? And how many professors are just going to veer away from topics or discussions because they're afraid a student's going to complain? NYU professor and best-selling author Jonathan Haidt, who is a liberal turned centrist, has talked a lot about the lack of intellectual diversity on our campuses and how this impacts education. And he talks about how when he tried for a speech on intellectual diversity, he wanted to talk to some conservative social psychologists. And he couldn't find a single one. And the only thing he could find is he found two not liberal, they weren't conservative, but they were sort of independent-minded graduate students, and he talked to them and he said that they reminded him of closeted gay people in the 1980s, that they were so afraid of showing who they were that they even disagreed with certain liberal ideas, that they sort of lived in the closet, these sort of closeted non-liberals, and that it impacted the research that they did, because one said, I think I could do really good research, but I'm going to reach the wrong conclusions. And so I think I'm probably not going to be able to work here. I'm not going to be able to pursue this. And this was something that Haidt pointed out, this is impeding science. This is not intellectual. And there needed to be more intellectual diversity, which would also, include assurances of free speech and lack of retaliation for expressing the wrong views. Unfortunately, we seem to be headed in a different direction from intellectual diversity. In fact, the liberal professor who I talked about earlier in the speech, who had to write anonymously, the way that he said that he had responded to what was happening on his campus was to scrub his class syllabus of anything that might offend one of his students. And to a certain extent, this is an understandable response. He doesn't want to get fired. He's put a lot of time in doing what he's doing. He's probably spent a lot of time in school. He's probably spent a lot of time building a career, and he probably likes it. But I think it's the wrong response, because this is clearly a war of inches. It's inch by inch, they will chip away at your free expression. It will start with silly complaints about Taco Tuesdays and safe spaces and demands for trigger warnings. And then before you know it, Christians' core beliefs are being called hate speech and harassment, and peaceful pro-life demonstrations are now an act of violence. So where does this end? I'm talking to you because you are the future leaders of our country, and you have a responsibility to stand up for free speech, and you will go into all sorts of different industries when you leave here, and will probably have a lot of influence on our culture. And so I think you have to ask yourself, what kind of country do you want to live in? Do you want to live in the land of the free and the home of the brave, or do you want to live in the land of the silenced and the home of the afraid? And the story I want to leave you with is a story of somebody I know named David French, and he's a free speech advocate. And he's a Harvard Law grad and an evangelical Christian. And he told me the story of when he was serving on the Cornell admissions committee. There was a student who came up before the committee, and he couldn't figure out why the student was there because it was a slam dunk. He said the student should have been accepted immediately. And then he realized what the problem was. When he got the application, his colleagues had written on it, they didn't want a Bible-thumping student who might be a member of the God Squad on their campus. So French spoke up. He said, if you think that this person's bad, then I'm a fundamentalist. And he said that the energy immediately shifted in the room, that his colleagues were obviously embarrassed, obviously chagrined, because they knew David, they respected David, they liked David, and he didn't fit the stereotype. He didn't fit the stereotype they'd been fed about evangelical Christians. And in the end, they ended up voting, and they accepted the student. And David told me, this episode taught me a few things. First, anti-Christian discrimination can be reflexive, and I think that's true of any kind of discrimination. And second, a little bit of true intellectual diversity can go a long way towards reversing its effects. These folks were my friends, yet their biases were deeply ingrained. But what if French hadn't been there? Then the student almost definitely would not have been accepted. So to me, the moral of the story is clear. Whether you're liberal or conservative or somewhere in between, or politically and ideologically agnostic, please go into unlikely places and make unlikely friends. I mean, after all, I work at Fox News. You guys can go places where you're with people who are different. So don't insulate yourself, as so many Americans are doing these days, from people who hold views that differ from yours. And don't stay silent when people say things that need to be confronted. Challenge the status quo, debate issues with people that hold different views than you have, and stand up for what's right, because the fate of free speech is literally in your hands. Just don't let them take another inch. Thank you.
Ms. Powers, on behalf of General P and the Corps of Cadets, I would like to present this gift as a thank you for the time you've spent with us and the insights you've shared with us this morning.
Thank you so much.
These proceedings are adjourned. Thank you very much.